What's up guys, Tommy Bowyer here from Movie Rewind and welcome back to the History of Comic Book Film series. Today we will be talking about the Nolan era. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the Nolan era is a period from 2008 until 2015, which is heavily influenced by Christopher Nolan, who was the director of the Dark Knight trilogy, one of the most successful comic book film trilogies of all time. And the main idea in which Nolan had was creating comic book films which had a realism and grittiness about them, which made them a lot more darker than many of their flamboyant predecessors. Now, at the start of this era, a lot of comic book fans really enjoyed the new grittiness and realism which these films represented. Yes, that's what I want to see. Dark and gritty, yeah?
Yes,
dark and gritty, yeah.
Yes, have that.
Yeah, alright. However, by the mid-2010s, a lot of comic book fans were starting to get a bit sick of the realism and feeling that a lot of this newfound grittiness was starting to take away from what originally made comic book films so great. For God's sake, that's far too dark. I mean, I like my films dark, but that's too dark.
That's too dark, man. What?
I mean, comics are supposed to be fun. That isn't
That's
fun.
that was fun. That was crap.
No, yeah, fuck off.
Yeah, I'll just continue watching this.
So there are a lot of benefits for the Nolan era. However, there are also quite a lot of disadvantages about the Nolan era, which I would say we are still living with today. So we're just going to talk about them right now. Now, while many would say that Batman Begins kind of started the Nolan era, in my personal opinion, it was The Dark Knight, because that is when Christopher Nolan had the formula to a T. It was realistic, it was gritty, it was darker than many comic book films which were released previously. Now, that's not to say that there weren't dark comic book films before. For instance, Batman Returns was very dark. However, The Dark Knight was very successful and even earned Heath Ledger an Oscar. So it had a significant impact on how studios made comic book films. And a lot of the initial comic book franchises were very much influenced by the Nolan era. For example, The Amazing Spider-Man was heavily influenced by what Christopher Nolan had done, because Mark Webb, the director of that film, decided to take it in a more realistic option. It was a lot darker. Gone was the over-the-top shenanigans which the original Spider-Man trilogy had in it. And this was for good and bad things. It was nice to see Spider-Man in a more realistic setting. However, a lot of the original nostalgia which the original Spider-Man trilogy had was kind of lost. And that is one of the criticisms that many people have of how Christopher Nolan influenced comic book films, as he made them very bland and boring, and some would even say colourless, because there was hardly any colour in films which were influenced by him. Film franchises such as Fantastic and Watchmen, a lot of people would say, have lost their way because they went around a very darker way. However, Christopher Nolan is not the only influence in the Nolan era. Of course, he only did the Dark Knight trilogy, although he did influence a lot of other directors to continue the dark and grittiness of comic book films. Mark Webb, as I've already said, is one. However, probably a more famous one is Zack Snyder. Now, Zack Snyder was the director of Man of Steel, which was very different to any other Superman film released, because it was really serious and they tried to make Superman really dark and complex and layered. And while a lot of people enjoy that movie, a lot of people look at it now and say that some characters such as Batman really do suit a darker tone. However, characters like Superman, which are supposed to be, you know, you're supposed to be hopeful and kind of inspired by Superman, that was kind of lost in Man of Steel because they made him very dark and some would even say quite a dangerous character, which a lot of people were scared of. So while I say that the Nolan era influenced a more darker tone in comic book films, they started using that tone and that formula for a lot of comic book films which really didn't need it. DC were really affected by this, and a lot of people have said that DC have gone really darker, and even to this day they are trying to figure out, are they doing really dark films or are they trying to do lighter films? So I think it's just one of those balancing acts in which the entirety of DC are confused. They were so influenced by Nolan's legacy on the Dark Knight films that they still don't know what tone their comic book films should really be. So I think the main thing which spelled the end of the Nolan era was the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While DC were going down this route of more darker stories with Zack Snyder, Marvel were doing very colourful stories and audiences loved them. A lot of people loved the MCU because they said it was colourful, it weren't dull, dark and depressing. And I'd say that after the release of Batman vs Superman, there was a significant backlash for DC to lighten up their films, and you can really see that to this day they are starting to release films which are more lighter and jokey in turn. However, I wouldn't say that dark comic book films have ended yet. For example, Joker's release last year did show that there is still a place for dark comic book films which can generate a lot of critical and commercial success. However, I think that the main thing to see from the Nolan era is that if you do something once, then it can work. With the right comic book characters, you can do a darker story. However, some characters, I'd say Superman, I might even put Spider-Man in there, should be lighter in tone because the comic books which the source material comes from is a lot lighter in tone, whereas Batman comic books are generally more darker. So I think that it just depends on what film. And it shouldn't just be, well, the audiences want to see all comic book films as dark and gritty or all comic book films as light and fun. Because it's not one rule for every comic book film. There should be a variety of them. So in conclusion, the Nolan era is a strange time in the history of comic book films. It really did affect how comic book films were made for a very long time. I would say that DC and Sony were very influenced by the Nolan era because they did try and make films a lot darker. However, when they started doing it with characters such as Spider-Man, Superman and Fantastic Four, which were more lighter, it really did start to have a backlash. While I'd say that the Nolan era is over, it can be seen that darker comic book films such as Joker are still being made, and who knows what will happen in the future. Oh, Bruce, you're back from vacation. Yeah, Bruce is back from vacation. I didn't forget to put him there. So thanks for watching, guys. I really do hope that you enjoyed this video. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe in order to receive great and maybe even improved quality content from me and Bruce in the future. And I will see you in another video. See ya!